So I'm going to be talking about the Chinese and Japanese writing systems. And some of what I'm going to say is going to be a little elementary, but since I know many people in my audience are instructors of Chinese, you might find some of what I say useful. I often explain these things that I'm going to be talking about today to my students when I teach traditional Chinese and Japanese literature, or in my courses on Chinese philosophy, when I talk about things like the Chinese philosophy of language in ancient times, things like Gongsun Longzi and Huizi, Tama de Kanfa. So I'm going to start with, this is a trailer for a science fiction film from 1960. It's not a well-known film. It's 12 to the Moon. I have seen the complete film. And it's fun if you like late 50s, early 60s science fiction films. But there's a particular scene in the trailer that is relevant, believe it or not, to our topic of the Chinese and Japanese writing systems. So let's just take a moment and enjoy this brief trailer together, and then I'll talk about why I've shown it to you.
You are there when two lovers disappear behind a solid wall of ice. You are there as deadly lunar ash swallows noted scientists. You are there when flaming meteors attack. You are there to see the weird hieroglyphics of disaster.
We advise and warn you, return to Earth at once. We have the power to immobilize you at will.
You are there.
All right, so the reason I showed you that clip is in a small scene, which you can get a taste for in this trailer, the astronauts who are traveling to the moon receive a transmission from an alien species. And the transmission is in the form of these symbols. And the captain says, "Why, they look like hieroglyphs." And so he calls over the one Japanese member of the crew and has her sight translate the alien script. Now, the logic, in scare quotes, of this, little scene seems to be, well, she's a Japanese crew member, so therefore she knows Chinese. Since she knows Chinese, she can read any kind of pictograph-based writing system, so she can sight translate alien script, Martian script. Now, of course, this is ridiculous and arguably kind of racist, but still there are a lot of misconceptions about how the Chinese and Japanese writing systems work that non-specialists often have. So that if you ask the average American or the average student coming into their first Chinese or Japanese class, they may have these misconceptions. They may think that in Japan, they use the writing system just the way they use it in China, or they may think there's something magic about the kanji or the hanzi and the way they're related to meaning. So part of what I want to address in this talk is some of those common misconceptions, or if you like, myth conceptions about the Chinese and Japanese writing systems. And my basic interpretation of how Chinese characters work, it's not my interpretation, it's derived from this classic ancient dictionary, the Shuowan Jiezi, whose title might be translated Explanation of Simple Characters and Analysis of Compound Characters. And this was compiled originally in the Han Dynasty by Shu Shan. And in his, we call it a preface sometimes, although technically it's a postface. In that work, Shu Shan gives 6 categories of Chinese characters. Now, if you know about Shu Shan's categories, you know one of those categories, the 6th one, no one's really quite sure what he meant by it. You may have your own theory about it and you're entitled to it, but still there's been a lot of dispute about that. But the other 5 categories that Shu Shan came up with, I think, and many other people think, are still very valuable for understanding how do the characters get created in the first place, how do they get their meaning. And so the 5 kinds of characters explained by Shu Shun that I'm going to talk about today are, in English, often called pictograms, simple ideograms, complex ideograms, phonetic loans, and semantic-phonetic compounds. Those are common English translations of their Chinese names. I'll talk about their Chinese names in a second. But to help students understand how these forms of characters work, I've come up with some examples that are from symbols that pretty much anyone today will be familiar with, not Chinese characters. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to give you examples of symbols that are not Chinese characters, but that illustrate these 5 principles. And then I'm going to give you examples of Chinese characters that fit under each of these 5 types, and I'll tell you the Chinese names for these 5 types. So first we've got pictograms. Now, how does a pictogram work? A pictogram starts out as a picture or a drawing of something, usually like a stick figure or a simplified drawing of something. And then the meaning is suggested by what the pictogram is a picture of. So on the upper left here, we've got a picture of a burning cigarette, and this symbol of a burning cigarette with a circle around it means smoking is allowed here. Now, you almost never see this symbol anywhere because smoking is allowed almost nowhere, but I'm old enough to remember when you could actually see this symbol someplace. But yeah, it's a picture and it just suggests the meaning smoking is allowed here. Upper right, there's a kind of a line drawing of a person in a wheelchair. We use that to represent this place. Sometimes an entrance or sometimes a bathroom is handicap accessible. And on the bottom, we have a heart, often used to express love or affection. And already we notice something interesting. If you've ever taken biology, you know that that symbol of a heart looks nothing like an actual heart. But as little children, we're taught, oh, that's a picture of a heart. And so you learn to associate it with things that we associate with a heart, like love. And this teaches you that there's an element of conventionality, even in pictograms. Right? So unlike what that movie suggested, pictograms aren't magic. They're just drawings, but they're drawings that are only conventionally connected to a certain meaning or significance. The next category of symbol is an ideogram. And ideograms aren't pictures of anything, but by their structure, they somehow hint at their meaning. So the symbol on the upper left here is the recycling symbol. It's not a picture of recycling. It's 3 arrows interconnected, and it kind of suggests the meaning of taking something, converting it into something else, converting it into something else, then converting it into the first thing again. The upper right symbol is U-turns allowed. Again, it's not a picture of anybody doing a U-turn, but it suggests the U-turn motion. And then the 5 hash marks on the bottom suggest the number 5. They're not a picture of the number 5 because the number 5 is an abstract entity. You can't have a picture of it. There are not too many ideograms, but these are some nice examples of them. Again, they're not pictures, but something about the structure of the character hints at its meaning. Oops, sorry, I went the wrong direction there. In a complex ideogram, you take 2 symbols, each of which is independently meaningful. Maybe they're a pictogram or maybe they're an ideogram. But then you combine these independent symbols, and the meaning of the whole symbol is suggested by the combined meanings of their parts. And one of the most common complex ideograms in everyday use is a pictogram of something with a line through it. So, like I say, you almost never see the symbol smoking allowed here, but you often see the symbol for no smoking. And how does that work? You got a pictogram of a burning cigarette, but then you have a line through it saying, no, you're not allowed to do that here. Or on the upper right here, we've got the U-turn symbol, but a line through it. So U-turn, but no, you're not allowed to do that. So you're combining the no symbol with the U-turn symbol. On the bottom, you have stick figures of a woman and a man. And when you put them next to each other with a line down the middle, we know from every airport we've ever been in that this means restrooms, or it might mean gender neutral restroom. Why? Because you take the symbol for man, you put it next to the symbol for women. And again, largely by convention, we know that that's a symbol for bathrooms, especially unisex bathrooms. So again, even in the case of a complex ideogram, the connection between the symbol and its meaning has an element of conventionality in it. Now, to understand the next kind of characters, we have to be a bit more imaginative. When I don't know if they still do this with kids, but when I was little, one of the fun things that we would do in grade school is we would do little games like this, where you come up with a sentence that doesn't have any ordinary words. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but again, I learned little games like this. This is a sentence. What does it mean? It means I love you. How does it get that meaning? Well, in the middle symbol, of course, is a pictogram of a heart. On the right, we have a pictogram of a finger pointing toward the speaker, and that suggests the meaning of you. But how do we know the first symbol means the first person pronoun I? Well, the second and third symbol are pictograms. The first symbol is a phonetic loan. And in a phonetic loan, you take a symbol, which in this case, this is a picture of an I from a US dollar bill. And it's this kind of I, EYE, but here it's being used to represent the pronoun I, which is pronounced the same way. So in a phonetic loan, you take a symbol that already has a meaning and already has a pronunciation, but then you borrow it, you loan it for some other word that is pronounced the same or almost the same, and you use it for that other word. These are called a rebus in English, R-H-E-B-U-S. Well, here's a little bit more complex sentence. What does this one mean? Well, this one means I see you. But notice this is getting kind of complex now. So the first symbol is a phonetic loan. Or a rebus, as we'd say in English. In the second case, the pictogram of the I is being used to represent seeing. And then the finger pointing at the person is still you. Now, we understood this sentence, but if we had a complicated language with lots of symbols like this, it might get confusing trying to figure out when is the I pictogram for the first phonetic loan for the first person singular pronoun I, and when is it an actual pictogram of an I that refers to something like seeing, or when does the I symbol refer to the physical organ of the eye? And so you might start combining characters to disambiguate symbols that would otherwise be ambiguous. And so you might get a sentence like this, I see you, but written in a different way. In this case, the second and the third character are pictograms. The first one is a semantic-phonetic compound. Why? You have one part of the symbol, the I symbol, that gives you a hint about the pronunciation. It's pronounced I. And then you've got another part of the symbol, a stick figure of a person or a man, and that suggests, oh, we're using this symbol to represent something that sounds like EYE, but has to do with a person. Oh, it's the pronoun I. I get it. And that is called a semantic-phonetic compound. So these are, I had to get a little clever towards the end here, but most of these are kind of, simple everyday illustrations of these principles, but how do they apply to actual real Chinese characters? Pictograms, that's going to be 象形字 in Chinese. Here are some examples of pictograms. And I can tell by my audience names that the vast majority of our audience, I'm not going to tease you about what these mean, because the vast majority of people in my audience already know what these mean. But when I'm teaching students who haven't necessarily studied Chinese about characters, I usually write these on the board, and then I say, okay, No fair cheating if you already know Chinese or Japanese. But if you haven't studied Chinese or Japanese, these are pictograms. These are originally pictures of things. What do they mean? In the 30 or so years I've been using this example, I think one student guessed correctly one of these. I don't know how, but I think one student once guessed correctly. Is the first one the sun? And I'm like, oh, very nice. You're the only one to ever get any of them. Now, if you go back to the earliest forms of these pictographs, it's a little easier. And we'll talk about the origin of these forms in just a minute, where these came from. But even then, I mean, look at the picture of the sun on the top. Does that pictogram on the left, if I had to guess what that was, I'd say, is it a human eye? But it's not. It's a pictogram of the sun. The second one, of course, a pictogram of the moon, but can you just tell that by looking at it? The third one is a pictogram of a woman. It's a picture of a woman kneeling. As you may know, there's some controversy about that one. Some people think the reason that Yu is a pictogram of a woman kneeling is that it suggests the subservience of women. So that kind of sexism is built into the character, according to some people. But another theory is that women traditionally weaved in ancient China. And if you're weaving, you're kneeling at a loom. And so of someone kneeling, you think, oh, they're working a loom. I'm not taking a stance on that. The fourth one, child, the pictogram version on the right, again, I wouldn't necessarily guess that was a child, but you might be wondering, why aren't there any legs on the child? Well, we're supposed to imagine that it's a baby wrapped in what we say in English, swaddling clothes. So it's a baby wrapped in a tight blanket. And so you can't see the individual legs. So again, these begin as pictograms, but there's an element of conventionality in the way they're connected to meaning. Nowadays, as you know, is not normally used to represent the sun. It's normally used in things like dates to represent the day of the month. And yue isn't normally used in modern Chinese to represent the moon, not by itself. You use it to represent month, things like that. So again, I'm just stressing that even in the case of pictograms, there's an element of conventionality in how they get their meaning. Simple ideograms in Chinese, 只是字. And there are not too many actual simple ideograms. The number 1 is an obvious example. The number 2, just 2 lines to represent the number 2. 3, yeah. I always like to tease students by saying, I bet you can guess what number 4 is. No, it's not what you think it is. And then above and below are said to be simple ideograms as well. You have a horizon line, and then you've got a line above the horizon and a third line pointing to the line above the horizon. And then sha, below, again, horizon line, line below the horizon, a line pointing to the line below the horizon. Compound ideograms, 会意字. Again, not too many of these actually, even according to Shu Shun, but there are some. The traditional examples that people use are things like the character for bright. The sun and the moon combined supposedly are very bright. There are different interpretations of the origins of this character, but this is like a common one that people give. Hao or how, often used to mean good or to be good in modern Chinese. But as I'm sure you know, hao in the fourth tone, meaning to be fond of, is also a traditional meaning. And so one theory is that a woman's fondness for her child, that's how these come together to give the meaning of to be fond of. And lin, meaning forest, trees coming together, kind of an obvious one. And a fun one, jian, meaning licentious, is the woman character 3 times in a row. If you just imagine somebody who's just, you know, a very lustful man who's just crazy about women, or a lustful woman who's crazy about other women, you know, that's represented by someone who's just seeing all these women in front of him. Phonetic loans, again, 假借字. Again, a phonetic loan is when you borrow a character that already has a meaning and a pronunciation, and you use it for a word that is pronounced the same or is pronounced similarly to it. And in many unearthed manuscripts, so manuscripts that we've discovered in recently unearthed tombs, we find this principle used a lot. It's very common to use homonyms, characters that are pronounced the same or almost the same, to represent other words. We find this very common in some unearthed manuscripts, not all of them, but some of them. So, but supposedly, and I'm just trusting the research of other people, the very common character lai was originally a pictogram of the goosefoot plant, but it was borrowed to pronounce the word for to come. Now, I'm sure some of you, maybe all of you already know this, but I'm using the modern Mandarin pronunciations here. Obviously, this is not what their ancient pronunciations would be, but we're just lucky here that the term for the goosefoot plant is in Mandarin about the same as for to come. The character qi is originally a pictogram of a basket, but it was borrowed for, among other things, a possessive pronoun, meaning her, his, or its. The number 4, I'm told, was originally a pictogram of nostrils. And for some reason, I feel like it's the nostrils on like a pig or a bull, although I don't know that for a fact. But then that was borrowed for the number 4. And in these cases, these phonetic loans became so common in their role as loan characters that they ceased to be used for their original meanings based on what they were pictographs of. And now, of course, we use a different character to represent the goosefoot plant. They added, the grass radical on top. For basket, they came up with a different character with the bamboo radical on top to represent basket. And for nostrils, of course, we just say something like in modern Chinese, bikong, instead of using the original se. Now, the last category is semantic phonetic compounds in Chinese, xing sheng zi. And there are a lot of examples of these. To illustrate them, I'm going to start. Now, mun, gate, is not a semantic phonetic compound. It's a pictogram of a gate. But it's a nice example because there are many semantic phonetic compounds that use mun as their phonetic component. So one, meaning to ask, you've got gate as the phonetic component, mouth as the semantic component. One, meaning to hear, you've got mun as the phonetic component, ear as your semantic component. The pluralizing suffix mun, again, gate is your phonetic component, and a version of the person radical on the side is your semantic component. And mun, you've got gate as phonetic, and then heart as semantic, meaning to be sad. And again, you decide, since I know that many of my audience are teachers tonight, you decide what works best with your students, but I find explaining these categories to my students helps demystify Chinese characters, and they begin to see, oh, there's a system here that goes back a long time, and it's an indigenous, Chinese scholars came up with this system, and it helps me to understand the structure of the characters. Now, it turns out statistically that about 97% of Chinese characters are semantic phonetic compounds. In fairness, a lot of times the phonetic compound isn't as helpful as it is in those examples that I just gave. But still, understanding that that's how the character is structured is often really useful information. And part of what this shows us is that, part of what's silly about the example from this movie and from this trailer, because there is an important phonetic aspect to most Chinese characters, in fact, all of them. And by the way, if you're wondering, yes, as we go back to the earliest forms of Chinese characters, the percentage of pictographs and ideograms and compound ideograms goes up. But I'm advised by people who specialize in this that even in the earliest forms of the Chinese language we've discovered, still the majority are semantic phonetic compounds. Well, one of the big controversies in writing Chinese characters is the distinction between traditional versus simplified characters. And so I like to explain to my students, so if you want to say to study 学习, traditionally you'd write it like this, but after Chinese communists gained control of the mainland in the Chinese Civil War in 1949, a few years after that, they simplified many characters, not all of them, but many of them, in the hopes that it would improve literacy and make it easier for people to learn to read and write. Sometimes the simplifications are very extensive, like they are in this case. Other times, this is a 中国话, this is Chinese language. You can write that in simplified characters. The first character in this case is not simplified at all, and there are characters for which the simplified form is the same as it is the traditional form. 国, meaning country or nation, is pretty simplified here. 话, the third character, it's simplified a little, but not too much. And so you'll often find that when you compare traditional versus simplified characters. This is how you would say long form or traditional character in traditional characters, 繁体字. This is how you would write that out in short form characters. Notice, again, the middle character is very simplified. The first and the third characters in this compound character expression are not really simplified. And then to say simplified characters, you write 简体字, and that would look like on the right there in simplified characters. Things have changed over time. I'm old enough to remember when there was a lot of passionate disagreement within the Chinese community about traditional versus simplified characters. So, like many people my age, I studied Chinese in Taiwan. And at the time that back when I'm told that earlier generations of, white guys who came to Taiwan to study Chinese, you would be given a key to a special room in the language school where they had documents written in simplified characters, because it was so politically controversial whether you were going to use traditional characters like they do in Taiwan or simplified characters like they use in the mainland, that if you were learning Chinese in Taiwan at a certain period in history, you literally needed special authorization to even possess or read documents written in simplified characters. And they'd let the foreigners studying Chinese read those documents because they knew that many of them were being trained to study all of China, including mainland China, and so would need to be able to read these things. My sense is that people are not quite as passionate about it today, although maybe I'm wrong. You can correct me in the Q&A session. In fairness, a few years ago, I gave a talk in Chinese at a philosophical conference, and generally every time I visited China, people are overwhelmingly welcoming and friendly and very supportive of me. But at this particular event, a copy of my talk I distributed so people could read what I was trying to say in my muddled pronunciation. And one person in the audience, got up and said, and he was dressed like an old-fashioned Maoist, and he was like, well, I just want to say, if you're going to come to China, you've got to write characters the way we write them here, not these forms. And I'd accidentally included long-form characters in my talk. And my host, in fairness, stood up and defended me and said, look, he showed me the talk. I should have corrected those characters. Let's not get upset about it. So some people are still very passionate about this. Personally, I'm a fan of traditional 繁体字. But everyone learns in the US, when you're learning them, you learn the 简体字, the simplified characters as well. So I can read them both. So how many characters are there? There was an article that came out in the New York Times when I was in graduate school, and it said that a new Chinese dictionary had come out that had 1 million characters in it. And one of my friends showed me the article and said, boy, you're never going to learn all these characters. There are not 1 million characters in Chinese. So how many are there? It's a complicated question. It depends on how you count them, right? So just to give you a sense, you might have heard of the Oxford English Dictionary. The Oxford English Dictionary is the authoritative comprehensive dictionary of the English language. There's about 250,000 words in the Oxford English Dictionary, about 250,000. No English speaker knows, much less uses, all 250,000 words in the Oxford English Dictionary. The Oxford English Dictionary includes words like fardels or bodkin, and those are two words you'll find in Shakespeare's writings. But no one except a real nerd like me, knows what fardels means or knows what a bodkin is. Or, if you say hoist on your own petard, which is another phrase in Shakespeare, no one says petard anymore. Apparently it's a kind of mortar. So it's like that with Chinese. There's a lot of characters that nobody knows anymore and nobody uses anymore, but a really comprehensive dictionary will have them, as it should. So on the left here, we've got the Hanyu Dazhidian, and that's a pretty comprehensive dictionary. It has over 60,000 characters in it. Again, nobody knows all those characters. Nobody can read all those characters. But it's a comprehensive dictionary, so it's got them in it. On the right is Liang Shichou's Far East Chinese English Dictionary. When I was a student back in the day, this was my desk dictionary when I used a Chinese English dictionary. And Liang Shichou has a little over 7,000 characters in it. Now, I read some pretty obscure stuff because I read some modern Chinese texts and some classical Chinese texts. Over decades, I can count on one hand. So there's 5 or fewer times where I have not been able to find a character in Liang Shichou's Chinese English Dictionary, which has 7,000 characters in it. So how many characters are there? Well, there's over 60,000 in principle, but nobody uses all those or knows all of them. If you've got more than 7,000, you've got plenty. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the statistics that if you recognize 3,000 characters, you know about 99% of the characters that you're likely to encounter in ordinary texts. Now, I hasten to add, and I know, just because you recognize the character doesn't mean you understand how it's being used in this context, especially if it's in a compound expression. But again, we're talking about how many characters are there. 3,000 is plenty. A high school graduate in China knows more than that, but 3,000 is still a lot. So how did Chinese writing evolve? Well, the traditional story is that this guy, Zhang Jie, is responsible. And according to tradition, Zhang Jie had 4 eyes, as you can see in this diagram here. He was supposedly a minister to the Yellow Emperor, whose traditional dates are the mid-3rd millennium BCE. And allegedly, Zhang Jie invented Chinese characters after looking at bird tracks and learning that different birds had different kinds of tracks. I don't think that's true personally. It's a fun story. It's not even clear to me the Yellow Emperor actually existed, but I don't want to step on anybody's toes if you believe in those things. But that's a traditional story and it's fun to tell students. What do we know for sure? Well, here's a couple quotations from Chinese texts. The Great Plan section of the Classic of History says, "When you have doubts about any great matter, consult with your own mind, consult with your high ministers and officers, consult with the common people, consult the tortoiseshell and divining stalks." And we're going to see the tortoiseshells were one of the early samples of Chinese writing that we have. Now, if we turn to Mozi, this ancient philosophical text, there's a passage where Mozi is asked, how do you know what the ancients said and what they did? And Mozi says, well, I'm not of their age or time, and so have not personally heard their voices or seen their faces. But I know this by what is written on bamboo and silk, etched on metal and stone, and inscribed on basins and bowls that have passed down to us through succeeding generations. So remember the shells, the bamboo, the silk, and the inscribed metal and stone basin and bowls. The earliest samples of Chinese writing that survive to this day are oracle bone inscriptions. And these things are fascinating. I wish I had more time to go into the whole oracle bone situation, but the in ancient times, particularly in the Shang dynasty, although we have some samples that date from the Zhou dynasty, the king would divine the will of the spirits and divine the future by by preparing bones. They're often the plastron, the bottom part of a turtle shell, but sometimes they would use like the thigh bone of an ox or something else. They would prepare them, dry them, and then they would apply a heated rod to them, and then they would intone a ritual question in both a positive and a negative form. And then they would apply the heated rod to the bone and it would crack. And using some method we no longer understand, they would read the cracks. Then, if we're really lucky, they would inscribe on the bone the question they asked. And if we're really lucky, they'd inscribe the answer they got. And if we're super lucky, in a few rare cases, they inscribed what actually happened in the end. And these are our earliest surviving samples of Chinese writing. So you can see the parallel inscriptions on the right-hand side and the left-hand side here. I've written as close as I could get to the original characters, their modern forms. And so you can see how the oracle bone script differs from the modern script. First, it gives you the day on which the crack making was done using the traditional heavenly and earthly stems and branches. And it says, so crack making on day Uu, the diviner's name is Gu, and then the pronouncement that they're testing is Bon will not have misfortune. But then they write on the opposite side, the mirror image, the opposite result. Crack making on day Uu, Gu divining Bon perhaps will have misfortune. So it will not have misfortune or it will have misfortune. They write it in these two ways. And we suspect this is what they intoned while they were producing the cracks. And as I said, we know that the characters were written after the cracks were done. So if you look, you can see these look very different in form from modern characters, but they are the ancestors of many modern characters. Then at some point, people started inscribing text on things like basins and bowls and bronzes of various kinds. And this particular inscribed bronze vessel dates from around 1000 BCE, which would put it in the early Zhou dynasty. On the left, we've got a rubbing of the inscription. And then on the right, the black columns are the original text written in bronze. And then in the white columns just to the left are the modern versions of those characters. So again, some of these are hard to read, but you can see they're getting closer to the modern characters that we know now. As Mozi points out, things were also written down on bamboo strips and silk. And we do have surviving examples of bamboo texts and silk texts that are quite old that have been unearthed from tombs after thousands of years. We're lucky when we get those, but we do have some of them. The bamboo strips on the left, this is an actual photograph of some bamboo strips in a museum. We know that the original form these bamboo strips were in is they were bound together and rolled into rolls like that shown on the left. These are modern texts, but we know that's what the bamboo strips, the form they were originally in. And then at some point, we got these traditional style book binding. And this is kind of fun. I have some examples in my office that I bring out to show my students. They would bind the books in little fascicles or little booklets. And then you'd have several of these little fascicles or booklets that are bound together, and you'd put them together, and then you put them in a box that you'd seal. And that was what a book was before modern bookbinding techniques were imported for the West. So very cool. I love books like this. So we can see that Chinese characters have really been written in a lot of different styles. This is a fun chart. that shows the evolution of a number of characters from their oracle bone inscriptions, from the bronze epigraphy versions of them. And then later, what's called the large seal script is kind of a development of the bronze script. The small seal script that's still used for personal identity seals is a variation of that. And then if you're actually teaching people to write long form characters, what I was taught to write back in the day was kaishu, the standard kind of nice form of them. Although you also have at the bottom in the last row, we have the simplified script versions of them. And of course, there's also running script and draft or grass script, which are kind of like the fast written, like when I learned to print in grade school, but then I learned cursive for writing quickly. And there's also, of course, Chinese versions of cursive. But interesting side note, this may be, you may already know this, or this may be news to you depending on your age. There actually was a period in history where there were Chinese typewriters. And there's a really fascinating book about this by Mulaney, The Chinese Typewriter: A History, that I recommend to you. And this is a sample of a traditional Chinese typewriter. And here's doesn't want to advance for me. There we go. Here's a close-up of the Chinese typewriter. And then again, I'm 59. I remember in graduate school, we were just seeing computers used to write Chinese and then print them out on, dot printers. And so that was like new technology. And now, younger generations are so used to entering Chinese characters on their phone that many people are forgetting how to write by hand characters. So many people don't know how to write kaishu anymore, or they can barely do it because they just type things in using some kind of input system. Well, I promised I'd say something about how Chinese characters came to Japan and how they're used there. I find this story fascinating. During the Yamato period in Japanese history, there was a move to centralize government in Japan. And as part of centralizing government, what the powers that be in the Yamato decided, we're going to adopt the Chinese writing system. We're going to adopt a lot of classic texts from China. We're going to learn to read them. We're going to learn to write in Chinese. We're going to write our own versions of the Chinese classics of poetry and history. And we are going to adopt large parts of Chinese government and culture. And this overlaps with the Tang Dynasty in China. So many of the things that were adopted in this period were influenced by Tang Dynasty culture. And this is really a fascinating development because, as you may or may not know, spoken Japanese is not in the same language family as spoken Chinese. The Sino-Tibetan language family is one family. Japan is often, although there's some controversy about this, classified as an Altaic language. It's a completely different language family. And as we'll see, this makes it kind of hard for people in Japan to have adapted the Chinese writing system. Why so? Well, let's look at some examples. So suppose, and when I say spoken Chinese, I mean spoken Mandarin. I know there are other dialects, but I'm just using this as an example. If you wanted to say to drink is the infinitive form of the verb in English, or the stem form of the verb we sometimes say in other languages. In Japanese, that would be nomu. In Chinese, it could be yin. So far, no problem. But what if you wanted to say present tense drink? Well, in Japanese, that's nomimasu. You conjugate the verb. In Chinese, it's yin. What if you wanted to say past tense drank? Again, you conjugate the verb in Japanese. It's nomimashita. In Chinese, it's yin. What if you wanted to say, you want to negate the verb, nomimasen? So you conjugate the verb to indicate negation in Japanese. In Chinese, you add a negative adverb, bu, and you make bu yin. What if you wanted to say potential, can drink? In English and in Chinese, you add a helping word before the verb, but in Japanese, you change the verb conjugation. Can drink is nomeru. And if you want to say drink, everybody have a drink. That's nominasai in Japanese, but in Chinese might be yinba. So the point I'm making is that spoken Japanese is a highly inflected language. Chinese is not. That makes it much easier to use characters for Chinese, but much more problematic to use characters to represent spoken Japanese, because how are you going to represent the verb endings? Well, the solution people came up with is, in Japan, they use the kanji, hanzi, for the stem of the verb, but then they use a special phonetic script, okurigana, for the ending on the verb. So nomu is written like that in Japanese. Again, in Chinese, you just say yin. Drink, nomimasu. And again, the first symbol is a kanji, a character adopted from China. And then the next three symbols are phonetic symbols, which were developed in Japan just for this purpose, to give you the verb ending. Again, in Chinese, it's just yin. Drank, nomimashita. Chinese, yin. Not drink, nomimasen. In Chinese, buyen. Can drink, nomeru. In Chinese, huiyen. Drink, nominasai. In Chinese, ginba. So part of what's distinctive about the way Chinese characters were used in Japan, originally people did just learn to read straight classical Chinese, and they wrote actually quite elegant classical Chinese. But then over time, and this system really became common in the Tokugawa period to some extent, and then it really became standardized after the Meiji Restoration in the 19th century. They use the characters with this phonetic script to represent things like the verb endings and also grammatical particles. Now, there are actually two phonetic scripts they use in Japan, hiragana and katakana. And they use them in slightly different contexts. We don't have time to go into that here. But how did hiragana and katakana develop? This is a wonderful video I found online. I won't show you the whole thing. We'll just watch a little bit of it. It shows you how the hiragana, this phonetic script used to represent things like the endings on verbs, developed from characters. Let's just watch this together for a moment. Isn't that fun? So that's how they developed the hiragana, and the katakana developed similarly. So I know a little bit of Japanese, not too much, but the main reason I learned some Japanese was so I could read reference works and translations of classical Chinese text in Japanese. And the different ways that people in Japan use Chinese characters are nicely illustrated by this page. This is a page, I have this book in my office. It's a Japanese edition of the Mengzi, which I believe in Japanese is pronounced moshi. And if you look carefully on the page, we've got three different kinds of texts here. First, we've got the original text of Mengzi 7A1 in classical Chinese. Then we've got the text of the Mengzi, but written in Japanese grammatical word order with the stem endings on the verb ended. That's a kurigana. And if you look carefully beside the characters, they've got some tiny little, phonetic symbols written beside the characters to the right. That's furigana or ruby, which is a way of telling you how to pronounce the characters in case you're not sure. And then finally, you've got an idiomatic modern Japanese translation of the original text. So again, there was a period in the history where the Chinese scholars could read and write fluently standard classical Chinese, even though that language is not related to their native spoken language. Then they gradually started to use these phonetic scripts to tell themselves how to pronounce the characters and also to give you verb endings and some grammatical particles that help you to understand it. And then eventually they learned to write idiomatic Japanese using some characters with verb endings and grammatical particles in these phonetic scripts. So in this page, we can see a little bit bigger. I had to cut off the bottom of the text so you can't see them completely, but on the far left here, we've got the kanbun, which is a fancy way of saying it's Chinese text. And this is exactly what Mengzi 1 on the far left. This is exactly what Mengzi 7A1 looks like. Again, if you look carefully, you'll see some little marks after some of the characters, and you'll recognize a little circle, multi-purpose mark of punctuation, but you also notice some numbers and some other symbols in there. Those are called kairiten. And many years ago, I learned how to read kairiten. I'm very rusty on them now, but basically kairiten are symbols that tell you how to reorganize the sentence in Japanese grammatical word order. And if you can use them, they're kind of useful, because if you're stuck on a passage in classical Chinese that's hard to read, there'll be a Japanese scholar who's translated that, and there'll be an edition that's got the kanbun with kairiten, and you can understand, well, this Japanese scholar who spent years studying this, what was her or his opinion about the grammatical structure of this passage. It's even easier in the middle part, which is the kanbun with okurigana and furigana. So the symbols that are going to give you the conjugation after the verb, and then the symbols that are going to tell you how to pronounce them. With that I find very useful if I'm stuck on a passage. I'll just look at a Japanese edition with okurigana and furigana, and with the help of a Japanese dictionary, I can figure out, oh, they think this is the verb, or oh, I see, they think this is modifying that. And sometimes when you're really stuck with some wenyan, that can help you out. And then they've got the modern Japanese translation, which is pretty idiomatic, the way you would write this out in literary, but still pretty idiomatic Japanese. And so that shows you the variety of ways that the kanji have been used in the Japanese tradition and gradually evolved into a distinctive writing system. So what have we learned tonight? Well, one thing we learned is that according to traditional Chinese way of categorizing the characters that goes back to the Han Dynasty in Shushan, there are 5 kinds of Chinese characters, which in English we often call pictograms, simple ideograms, complex ideograms, phonetic loans, and semantic-phonetic compounds. And especially in the first 4, you can find examples of symbols that are in common use today that kind of function like this. And with a little bit of imagination, we can understand what the 5th category of semantic phonetic compounds are as well. And this gives us a kind of way of systematizing how characters are used, and it makes it easier to understand for a Western audience. Chinese characters have been written in different styles over the years, and some of them you require special training to even recognize the early forms of these characters. And even today, I don't know about you, but whenever someone shows me, hey, you know Chinese, Brian, and they'll show me a scroll that they bought, or something, like a silk scarf that's got some characters on it, it's always written in like Cao Shu or something that's really hard to read. And I got to say, I'm not sure what that means. I got to be honest with you. So, but again, characters can be written, and also there's a distinction between the Fantizi, the traditional or long form, and the Gentizi, the simplified or short forms of the characters. Japan adopted Chinese characters, and at one point, Japanese intellectuals could fluently read and write Chinese, even though the Chinese writing system is not very well suited to spoken Japanese. But over time, they gradually evolved two phonetic systems, hiragana and katakana, to represent syllables in Japanese, and that allowed them to write verb endings and to write some words for which there weren't characters in common use. And that's the system they continue to use to the present day. And we learned that Chinese characters are beautiful and interesting, but contrary to some science fiction representations and some misunderstandings in everyday world, they're not magic hieroglyphs that you can just look at and see their meaning. There's always an element of conventionality in the relationship between a symbol and its meaning. And there's also a lot of phonetic information that's conveyed by many characters, even though sometimes today the phonetic element may be obscure to us. So when you're trying to figure out the etymology of a character, its history, or how did it get its meaning, you got to be careful to not confuse a genuine etymology based on a study of the character's actual history and development with a folk etymology of the history of the character, which might be very different. So thank you very much for your attentiveness. I hope you found something useful in my presentation. I'm Professor Brian Van Orden from Vassar College, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.